In the heart of Bavaria stands Landsberg, a prison where hundreds of people died in the most horrifying ways. Although it may seem unbelievable, many of the most infamous Nazi officers of World War II were executed there by the Allies. The level of sadism inflicted on these criminals was so extreme that political organizations mobilized to the prison gates to demand more humane treatment. In this new installment of military history, we want to take you inside the most feared Bavarian prison, one whose floors are still stained with blood. Let's begin with this chilling episode.
Eagerly awaited in every part of the world was the climax to the long and strenuous months of the Nuremberg trial. While the judges were considering their verdicts, the military authorities were redoubling their security precautions.
Once World War II ended, it was time to hold accountable and punish those responsible for the most inhuman acts of the conflict. This process included a series of trials, but also the establishment of prisons controlled by the Allies within German territory. Among these facilities was Landsberg, in the southwest of the German state of Bavaria, about 65 kilometers west of the country's capital. The U.S. Army designated the facility as War Criminal Prison No. 1. Between 1945 and the mid-1950s, it was used to house dangerous soldiers and leaders of the Third Reich. For this reason, it was managed and guarded by the military police of the U.S. Army, with sentries well armed and instructed to shoot without hesitation at any suspicious movement. The first prisoners arrived at Landsberg prison in December 1945. From then on, the flow of Nazi soldiers and high-ranking officials was constant. New faces filled with hatred and fear of what would happen to them in a prison controlled by their enemies arrived day after day. Between 1945 and 1946, the facility housed a total of 110 inmates convicted in the Nuremberg trials. Another 1,516 war criminals from the aforementioned Dachau trials and 18 individuals convicted in the Shanghai trials. The latter were military tribunals conducted by U.S. forces in Japan between August 1946 and January 1947, aimed at prosecuting 23 German officials who had continued to assist the Japanese army after the surrender of Nazi Germany.
At the end of the conflict, there were hunts for those war criminals who had committed crimes against people inside the concentration camps, and the Allies also looked for people who had committed crimes against Allied soldiers. With this, many German civilians who had supported the Nazis found themselves accused of murdering Allied servicemen.
The facilities were similar to other prisons of the time, with cells designed for half a dozen prisoners and a notable lack of hygiene and maintenance. Of course, the guards had no regard for the well-being of the men behind bars. They were seen as the worst of the worst and were treated accordingly. From food shortages to constant psychological harassment, the Germans had an uncomfortable stay at the war criminal prison. Let's review one of the most significant dates in the history of that place. On October 16, 1946, the central courtyard of Landsberg prison was prepared for 10 executions and to accommodate several dozen spectators. This date had been set as the final day for several of the prison's most infamous inmates, individuals who, through money or actions, had fostered the most atrocious war crimes in modern history. In that penitentiary gymnasium, one of the loudest met his end shouting, "Heil Hitler!" It was Julius Streicher, editor of the newspaper Der Stürmer, who, through the dissemination of racist stereotypes, even in children's books published by his press, was one of the principal instigators of anti-Semitism in the Third Reich. These images were captured during his trial at Nuremberg.
He was responsible for the demolition on August 10, 1938 of the synagogue in Nuremberg. And on November the 10th, 1938, he spoke publicly in support of the Jewish program which was taking place at that time. In the face of the evidence before the tribunal, it is idle for Stryker to suggest that the solution of the Jewish problem which he favored was strictly limited to the classification of Jews as aliens.
His influence led to the physical extermination of millions of people. But on that day in 1946, Stryker did not have the power to fight gravity. His body was about to be held by a rope tied to his neck, slowly suffocating him until the last spark of life was extinguished. When the mechanism was activated, blood and mucus bubbled from the Nazi's mouth, but he did not die. One of those present had to pull his legs hard and finally broke his neck. The person who assisted in the execution was Joseph Malta, who was then 28 years old. He was a military policeman sent to Landsberg to help with the control of the prisoners. Interviewed in the LA Times in 1996, 3 years before he died, he insisted that he did not regret anything. "It was a pleasure to do it. I would do it again." The difficult death of Stryker was no exception. There was a miscalculation in the length of the ropes, which meant that the prisoners did not die immediately, but rather in a long and tortuous process. Since they did not die from the cervical fracture, the Nazis were suffocating. From the 14 minutes that Joachim von Ribbentrop took, to the 24 that Wilhelm Keitel took. In his book Justice in Nuremberg, the researcher Robert E. Conant said that the scene was Dantesque. But after having heard all the testimonies and accusations that paraded through the trials, for those present, it evoked an almost biblical justice. The British press reported on the aforementioned problems with the length of the rope and that the condemned men hit their heads on the trapdoor when they fell. However, some experts consider that too much emphasis has been placed on the errors over the years for the sake of sensationalism. To this day, it is not known whether it was done intentionally in a position of revenge or simply a mistake.
A photographer would usually take a final photograph with the condemned stood over where they would seconds later be sent through. The executioner held the noose to the side, and he then took the condemned and placed a black cap over their head, before he finally secured the noose around their necks.
Joachim von Ribbentrop was able to utter a few sentences before the executioner activated the device. After expressing his love for Germany, the Reich's foreign minister said, "My last wish is for Germany to become one nation again, and for an agreement to be reached between the East and the West. I wish for the world to achieve peace." Words too solemn for a man who was an essential participant in Adolf Hitler's war machine. After the deaths of Stryker, Ribbentrop, and Keitel, the Allied military authority allowed the 30 present to smoke a cigarette. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, leader of the SS in Austria, said goodbye with a "Good luck, Germany." Alfred Rosenberg, on the other hand, left in silence. Hans Frank, governor of occupied Poland, smiling, said, "I thank you for the kind treatment I received during my captivity, and I pray to God that He accepts me in His mercy." The chief executioner was John Clarence Woods from Kansas. Most of the executions carried out in Landsberg prison bear his signature at the bottom of the documents. Time magazine recorded his statements after the famous October 16th. When asked if he had been nervous, he confidently replied no. A man cannot afford to be nervous in this business. After being examined by the doctor, the lifeless bodies of the Nazi leaders were collected by Rex Morgan, the American Army's chief undertaker in Europe. He placed the bodies in the coffins, where photos were taken and archived. He then transported them to the Dachau crematorium in Munich and, according to his son's publication, told the workers that they were American soldiers who had died in an aircraft accident. For 5.5 years, Landsberg prison was the site of the execution of nearly 300 war criminals condemned for heinous acts such as torture, experimentation, and civilian rape. If we differentiate according to the method used to end the criminals' lives, 259 death sentences were carried out by hanging and 29 by firing squad. A somewhat less painful, but also more costly method due to the use of ammunition. These processes were carried out swiftly, demonstrating a compassion and humanity that in many cases the Nazis had not shown towards their prisoners. In 1948, the Association for the Welfare of Prisoners of the Bavarian Ministry of Justice was the organization responsible for managing the basic needs of prisoners detained by the American military. With the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 and its abolition of the death penalty, appeals from politicians, churches, industrialists, and artists resulted in numerous petitions to close War Criminal Prison No. 1. It may sound strange in retrospect, but it was part of a widespread effort to move beyond the traumas of war and bring freedom to all Germans, even those who had committed inhumane acts during the conflict. In the latter half of 1950 and the first half of 1951, thousands of Germans participated in demonstrations outside Landsberg prison to demand pardons for all war criminals. Meanwhile, German media coverage was overwhelmingly on the side of the condemned, who were described as innocent victims of American lynch law. While the treatment received at this institution was not kind, the fact is that the purpose of the place was to carry out death sentences for some of the most savage and violent elements of the Third Reich. At Landsberg, young soldiers who had fought in the trenches or mechanics who had repaired planes in distant parts of Europe were not executed. Instead, it was there that men who had carried out the mass extermination of children, women, the sick, and the disabled were to be executed. Let us hear one of the many statements from the Nuremberg trials.
In connection with the administration of the concentration camps, the SS embarked on a series of experiments on human beings which were performed on prisoners of war or concentration camp inmates. These experiments included freezing to death and killing by poison bullets.
Although the protesters in Landsberg claimed to be motivated solely by opposition to the death penalty and to have no pro-Nazi or anti-Semitic feelings, their actions contradicted their words. When a group of Jewish protesters arrived in Landsberg demanding the execution of the 102 war criminals on January 7, 1951, the German protesters calling for amnesty began chanting the era's slogan, "Out with the Jews, out with the Jews," and then proceeded to beat the Jewish demonstrators. In early 1951, the Bavarian parliament passed a resolution declaring that all military prisoners in Landsberg, Werl, and Wittlich should be recognized as prisoners of war, making them the financial responsibility of the West German government. On January 2, 1951, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer met with the United States High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, to argue that the status of the Landsberg prisoners was less a legal issue and more a political one, and that executing the Landsberg prisoners would forever ruin any attempt for the Federal Republic to play its role in the Cold War. The German government's position was straightforward. If we annihilate our former military leaders, how could we convince our population that we are now allies? On January 31, 1951, High Commissioner McCloy, under strong pressure from German public opinion, agreed to review the sentences from the Nuremberg and Dachau trials. Of the 28 prisoners sentenced to death, only 7 death sentences were confirmed. Some civilian prisoners who had collaborated with Adolf Hitler's regime were pardoned. The other sentences were commuted to effective prison terms, averaging around 15 years. Let's look at one of the many German reports on the matter.
Kurz nach seiner Ankunft hielt der Hohe Kommissar eine Pressekonferenz ab, in der er die Richtlinien der künftigen amerikanischen Politik in Deutschland darlegte. Wörtlich sagte er, Deutschland muss zu einem friedlichen, freien und wohlhabenden Land gemacht werden.
The 7 death sentences confirmed by Commissioner McCloy were for what were considered the worst of the worst in Landsberg. These were criminals who had a direct impact on the Holocaust and whose actions had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The infamous list included Oswald Pohl, Paul Blobel, Otto Ohlendorf, Werner Braune, Erich Naumann, Georg Schallermeyer, and Hans Hermann Schmidt. The German public was not satisfied with McCloy's decision, and as a result, during the first half of the 1950s, the Federal Republic continued to pressure the commissioner to pardon the 7 convicted individuals. Enormous weekly demonstrations were held, demanding amnesty for the Landsberg prisoners. The final executions took place on June 7, 1951, but several prisoners still remained to be dealt with. The government of the Federal Republic of Germany in Bonn decided that war crime convictions by military tribunals should be considered foreign sentences and, therefore, not part of an individual's criminal record. In May 1958, the United States Army relinquished control of Landsberg prison when the last 4 prisoners were released. This marked the end of a story filled with debates, conflicting positions, and political negotiations.
Germany and Landsberg jail, where Hitler wrote some of Mein Kampf, opens to release 29 of his followers, all war criminals, among them Hans Kerl, former Minister of Church Affairs. Carrying flowers comes Alfred Krupp, head of the famous arms works, and sentenced to 12 years at Nuremberg. Now these former key men of Hitler's state face life as free men in post-war Germany.
To provide a context for what happened in that prison, by 1951, 284 war criminals had been executed there. Their bodies were not claimed by their loved ones. Evidently, SS officers had a better reputation among post-war German politicians than among their own families. The remains were then buried in a cemetery near Spottingen Chapel. In 1988, that site was declared a historic landmark, and today, it is maintained with public funds from local taxpayers. This grants a more than questionable honor to those graves, especially considering that the cemetery does not clearly indicate who is buried there and why they were executed. In light of such controversy, we would like to involve you in this debate that has been ongoing for over 70 years. Do you think the Nazi prisoners at Landsberg were correctly executed, or should they have been treated as prisoners of war? Leave your response in the comments box. Now, let's take a closer look at the stay of the most infamous inmate in the history of this prison. Between November 8th and 9th, 1923, Munich was the epicenter of an event that, in the long run, changed the history of the entire planet.
Hitler and his movement had attempted to overthrow the government of the state of Bavaria following years of economic misery and political turmoil following Germany's defeat in World War I in 1918.
That rebellion failed, and Bavarian security forces managed to contain the members of the National Socialist Party, many of whom ended up behind bars in Landsberg prison, including the future Führer. In 1924, Adolf Hitler spent 264 days in prison, during which he wrote Mein Kampf, which can be translated as My Struggle, a manifesto outlining his worldview that he compiled and published with the help of Rudolf Hess. Hess became one of his trusted associates an absolute fanatic who accompanied him for years during his political expansion. Adolf Hitler was released, smiling and proud, on December 20th, 1925. With 3 years, 333 days, 21 hours, and 50 minutes remaining of his brief 5-year sentence. This calculation was made by Ludwig Stenglein, the enraged prosecutor who had sought a severe punishment for the agitator who had committed the crime of high treason. It was the first brick in the construction of a new empire of terror. But what concerns us in this video is the penitentiary institution where he spent 9 months. A place that, over time, came under the control of various authorities, housing all types of prisoners. Today, the prison operates as a progressive correctional center that provides training, skills, and medical assistance to inmates. There are 36 courses in the Central Training Center offering training for occupations such as bakers, electricians, painters, butchers, carpenters, tailors, shoemakers, heating and ventilation workers, and masons. This chapter of Landsberg does not reflect at all the institution's turbulent past and all the bloodshed that occurred inside and outside its walls. Like all remnants of the Third Reich and the post-World War II occupation, its significance remains a subject of study and debate worldwide. Thus, we come to the end of this video. If you are interested in learning in detail about everything that happened in World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. That way, you can stay updated with all our material. With that, we say goodbye until the next edition of Military History. Thank you for joining us.